Well, thank you. And I really wish I was there with you in person. I really want to thank Anne Coates and Roger Bendel for inviting me to take part and for your academic generosity in opening this up to somebody you've never met and who's never been to Bermuda. It's much appreciated. And also to Deborah Atwood for your help too today. I'm a historian of 20th century British Empire, but on the other side of the world of South Asia. And I'm interested in military history, particularly the role of South Asians in land and air and at sea. So this talk today is just one slice of that, which is about the Lascars, the South Asian, particularly Indian and Pakistani seafarers. And it's a synthesis of some existing work and also some of my own research, especially on the Second World War. So for centuries, the British Empire ruled not only by land, but by sea, and central to its maritime dominance were the Lascars. These sailors, drawn from across the Indian subcontinent, the Arab world, East Africa, and Southeast Asia, were the backbone of Britain's merchant fleet, essential to global trade, war efforts, and the very functioning of the empire. Yet despite their enormous contribution, Lascars were often subjected to exploitation, racism, and erasure. I move this on. Here we are. The word Lascar is derived from the Persian lashkar, meaning army or camp. It entered European usage via Portuguese and eventually became a generic term used by the British to describe non-European seamen. Lascars were not a single ethnic group. They were drawn from a wide geographical spread: Bengal, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Oman, Somalia, even as far afield as the Malay archipelago. Many were Muslim, but also Hindu, Christian, Buddhist Lascars served aboard European ships. What united them was their shared experience of maritime labour under imperial regimes. They were recruited in colonial port cities, often through dubious contracts, and placed in the most grueling jobs on board: coal trimmers in the boiler rooms, deck hands, firemen, cooks, and stewards. And these roles could be physically punishing with temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius. The employment of Lascars dates back to the 16th century, when the Portuguese began hiring Indian sailors. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company was increasingly dependent on them, particularly for ships returning to Britain. Many British sailors deserted or died in India, creating a labour gap that the Lascars filled, and their numbers expanded rapidly, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. In just a decade, the number of Lascars employed on British ships increased sixfold. By the 19th century, with the advent of steam-powered liners and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Lascar labour became even more vital. European sailors balked sometimes at the hot, claustrophobic engine rooms, and Lascars were wrongly assumed to be biologically better suited for such hot conditions. So there's been quite a lot of historical work on Lascars, but it's still very emergent and very new. One of the pioneers was Rosina Visram, who wrote a book called Ayers, Lascars and Princes in the 1980s, which came out of her own community work in Britain with people of South Asian descent. And it was rooted in local histories and British community histories, and it was a really pioneering book. More recently, scholars like Gopalan Balachandran, Aaron Jaffa, Ravi Ahuja have been involved in thinking about the Lascars, and Caroline Adams created a very important collection of oral history interviews, also taken in the 1980s, with people who'd lived through the Second World War. But the work is patchy and it is still emergent, and that's something that I'll turn to later in this talk. Because for much of the 20th century, Lascars were ignored in official histories. Often they were illiterate, they didn't leave written records, they sometimes were involved in illegal activities, or they were also jumping ship. And so that made them reluctant to be interviewed or to leave remnants in the archives. And so what scholars describe as reading against the grain, trying to find bits of information about Lascars in things like court cases or in shipping manifests. Those are some of the ways that some of this history is being recovered. Some of the key historiographical debates include agency or victimhood. Were they purely exploited, or did they exhibit forms of resistance and autonomy? Should they be studied as a South Asian phenomenon or through global labour diasporas? Race and labour, how did their race shape their exclusion from unions and from more skilled jobs? And then the historical silence. Why have they been omitted from British war memorials, textbooks, and public memory, at least until quite recently? Sara Caputo, who's a historian who wrote the book The British Navy and Transnational Seafarers, about an earlier period, says, if much is left to be written on Americans, black sailors and lascars, other foreign groups remain almost completely obscure. We're also missing the big picture. It's only when we can incorporate all these men, not simply as distinct groups, but as an integral part of a diverse workforce. So I think one of the aspects that and why I was interested in this conference in Bermuda and why I turned to the Atlantic is that linking together Atlantic and Indian Ocean histories are often not connected. They're not often put together in the same frame. But I think there are definitely pieces of evidence where we could try and make those connections. So in Bermuda, evidence seems limited, and I'm hoping there may well be people there who know much more about this than me, but there must undoubtedly have been some Lascars coming through Bermuda. But unlike places in the Caribbean, such as Trinidad or Guyana, Bermuda didn't develop a significant or long-standing Indian community through indentured labour or early migration. But Lascars and transient sailors, as with many British Atlantic ports, did make occasional visits from ships with Lascar sailors from the 17th through the 19th centuries. But these were transient, didn't settle permanently, and there's very few substantial records. But people in Bermuda were certainly aware of Lascars. This was a British imperial maritime system with connected and networked ports, and there was interest and knowledge about Lascars in Bermuda. The Royal Gazette in 1900, for instance, serialized a story about Lascars, and although the setting was Calcutta, there was clearly a readership for this on the other side of the world in Bermuda. Alec Pearson wrote the story, and it was a sort of murder mystery, including sarangs and Lascars, called The Mate of the Brahmaputra, and it was serialized in the Gazette. In 1912, in Bermuda's Royal Gazette, there was also an article entitled "The Able Seaman: What Has Become of Him?" and it lamented the changeover to steam and the lack of skills in fancy knotting and splicing, that sailors were now becoming nothing more than deckhands. But it also reflected directly on the role of the Lascars and the need for manpower from around the world. The article said, how to get enough competent sailors to man the ships is a problem that every nation with a large mercantile marine is trying to solve. England ceased long ago to man her great merchant fleet with home-bred sailors. Nearly 1/4 of the seamen on British ships are foreign-born Lascars who cannot stand cold weather. So we come back again to that point about cold weather. Now, when we see the role of the Lascars becoming really critical and important is in the World Wars, and where they start to really become more present in the Atlantic, and that's a major change. Because permission for the employment of Asian Lascars, South and Southeast Asian seamen, on the North Atlantic route was officially granted by the British Admiralty during World War I, around 1917. Before this period, Lascars were generally contracted only on routes between Britain and Asia, particularly under contracts that specified that they should be used in warmer climes. So there was an actual climate clause in many of their agreements preventing deployment in cold regions like the North Atlantic due to concerns about the health and working capacity in such environments. But the heavy toll of World War I on British shipping and manpower created labour shortages, particularly in merchant shipping. And in 1917, the British government waived restrictions and allowed Lascars to be employed on the Atlantic routes, despite their prior contractual and regulatory limitations. This decision marked a significant shift in imperial labour practices and highlighted the wartime dependency on colonial labour forces. Despite this demand and need for this manpower and for these workers, the living and working conditions for Lascars were well known to be poor. There was a 1910 parliamentary report on Lascar conditions, which starkly illustrated the racial hierarchy aboard ships. Lascars received a fraction of white sailors' wages. Before the First World War, often 8 or 9 shillings a week, housed in cramped quarters below deck. Their food was of a lower quality and medical care was minimal. They were, at the start of the Second World War, still suffering these inequalities. So the monthly pay for Alaska on a merchant marine was £1 and 17 shillings, compared to £9 and 12 shillings for Europeans at the start of the Second World War. So it was a kind of Victorian system which was being imported right into the mid-20th century. These men themselves had very peripatetic lives. Ravi Ahuja, historian, points out their significant spatial mobility didn't reflect they had significant spatial mobility, but their occupational mobility remained constrained. So despite the fact that they're going all around the globe and they're seeing all sorts of things, they're being systematically excluded from higher paying positions and routes. British maritime law enforced this. Under Lascar agreements, men were not allowed to leave ships freely at British ports and were often confined to ships' premises or sent back to India on the next available vessel. The Asiatic Articles of Employment stipulated that they could only be discharged in Indian ports, effectively preventing them from settling in more prosperous regions, and presumably why few were in Bermuda. Additionally, British colonial policies, such as the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order of 1925, were designed to control the movement of non-European sailors, limiting their opportunities for settlement and integration into urban societies. By 1938, just over a quarter of merchant seamen on British vessels were Asian Lascars. And this was noticed, these kind of unequal conditions were noticed by people in Britain, by white British politicians and members of the public, as well as by the Asians themselves. Nye Bevan, the well-known British Labour politician, described Lascars in 1938 as cheap human fodder. And unsurprisingly, at the Second World War, that meant the start of some major strikes and protests, which I will talk about briefly. Now, as I've indicated, one of the issues we have is a lack of first-hand accounts from the Lascars themselves. But there are some interviews. A couple of people did take the time in the 80s, in particular, to interview elderly gentlemen who had served on these ships, particularly in the Second World War. For instance, Shah Abdul Majid Qureshi, who Caroline Adams interviewed in 1987, said, I was called a bunker man in the coal bunker. It was hot. Oh, yes, it was hot. We put coal in the boiler and then it gets hot and then the ship runs. It's a most difficult job, very hard and very hot. Many people died in the heat. In my sea life, I knew hundreds of people who died. Another first-hand account, also included in Caroline Adams' book, is with a man called Nawab Ali, who lived a long life and ended up retiring to Britain. He described in a very long interview how he was illiterate and unable to read and write. He was born in 1922. Both his parents died on the same day from an unknown disease when he was a small baby. And as a child, he ran away from home to join a boat crew as a child. So he, like many of the Lascars, started working on rivers and around the coastal trade rather than on sort of more international routes. He knew how to navigate rivers, how to mend boats and test the depths of waters. And then he was recruited onto a steamship. We don't know how old he was when that happened. He worked in the boiler room, which he also described as hot and dangerous and dirty. When he arrived in Britain, it was the 28th of August, 1939, so 4 days before the Second World War started. And he left his ship in Cardiff and became a runaway, living on the streets. And that was breaking articles, which many of the Lascars did for various reasons. He left his ship and actually ended up living on the streets for a few days. He remembered having soup from a Jewish man who gave him soup. He took a few jobs in restaurants, cafes, and hotels, washing up. Somehow he ended up with a job in Coventry, and then finally, after some time of this, he went back to sea, and he became a gunner on a ship's tower, but on a merchant ship, but that was armed. He went into the Mediterranean, And in the Bay of Naples, at a place called Bari, he was bombed. In fact, Bari is one of the most disastrous attacks on ships in the whole conflict. 28 merchant ships laden with important cargo and ammunition were sunk or destroyed, and 2,000 people were killed. So Nawab Ali was very lucky. After the war, he settled in the East End of London, started running a halal butcher shop and a cafe, and helped other settlers and migrants when they arrived. So, like many of the Lascars, you may well know, famously around the areas of Brick Lane, which are known for their curry houses and restaurants. He was one of the sort of pioneers of British South Asian food, and became a proponent of multiculturalism and plurality himself. So in the World War II, an estimated 250,000 Lascars served in the British Merchant Navy, making up about 1/6 of its personnel. And they manned convoys through the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic routes, and the Indian Ocean. But the expansion into the Atlantic was something much more different and more dangerous, and resonated with the Lascars themselves, unsurprisingly, because it was further from home, and the risks were now so high because of the attacks on convoys that we've heard about today. The SS City of Cairo, which was due to sail to Brazil, of the 158 Asiatic crew aboard, or Lascars on board, 70 were lost and 82 survived. And one notorious incident during the Second World War was the case of the SS City of Benares, a ship which was torpedoed while evacuating children to Canada. On the 18th of September, 1940, this terrible tragedy happened with 77 British children, some as young as 5 or 6, being killed through that, which was a tragedy that stunned the empire. But it was also a ship that had been manned very much by South Asian Lascars, and 160 of them on board. Of 160 of them aboard, 101 died or drowned. Many of them with very little details known about them, no dates of birth or surnames. So we have evidence like Soria, the apprentice, or Mubarak Ali, a baker. One, in fact, boarded a lifeboat, a 22-year-old called Abbas Bikku, and survived all the way to Scotland, but died shortly afterwards in Scotland, and his grave is still there in Greenock. So these kind of things really were global in the sense that they rebounded in areas that are now Bangladesh, and they rebounded in the Atlantic, and undoubtedly in places like Bermuda too. Yusuf Chowdhury, a child in Sylhet at the time, said, as the news came that the dead seaman's relatives and friends would gather and begin shouting and crying, bad news spread from house to house, village to village. The public became nervous, worrying that they would be next in line for this shock. The British public never heard the cry of the seamen's widows. And that's a quote taken from an interview by Georgie Weymouth. Now, with the SS Benares, City of Benares, there was a controversy in Parliament because the ship had been crewed largely by Lascars, and they were criticised for allegedly being unsuited to the cold Atlantic. So in a way, there was a little bit of scapegoating going on to the crew. An MP in Scotland, Robert Gibson, asked in Parliament, is the minister aware that there is a great deal of concern in various parts of the country because Lascars are obviously not suited to the cold North Atlantic winds? And Gibson asked the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs whose responsibility it was that the city of Benares had been manned by Lascars when it was evacuating children. Yet the official records of the Lascars actually defend their performance and reaffirm their professionalism in the sinking of that ship. Over 6,000 Lascars died during the Second World War, with many wounded or interned as well. So just to turn to the sort of resistance side, or the activism, which fed into decolonisation of the British Empire, Lascars repeatedly resisted their exploitation. One major site of resistance was the 1939 seamen strike in London and Liverpool, where Lascars joined forces with Caribbean and African sailors to demand equal pay, better food, and humane conditions. British trade unions were sometimes unsupportive, but ship owners did end up making concessions. In 1942, a Bengali crew of the SS City of Sparta mutinied after a U-boat attack, citing the ship's failure to provide lifeboats or basic safety measures. And in London, the Indian Seamen's Union, which was founded in 1939, had some quite famous leaders like Surat Ali and Ayub Ali, who kind of aligned themselves with the Labour Party and with the communists, and lobbied Parliament and gave public speeches connecting maritime labour exploitation to the colonial system as a whole. And there were lots of different cases in Liverpool, in Port Said, in Alexandria, with jailings, but also strikes, well, because of strikes and because of men refusing to sail because they were advocating for better conditions or for better better pay. And there were similar actions in ports across the British Empire, including Cape Town, Burma, and Australia. And actually, the British public response could often be sympathetic, despite the need for wartime shipping. In Liverpool, for instance, the local superintendent refused to arrest 83 men who were on strike, and they had quite a lot of local support. And there was also an Indian Comforts Fund run by British women that knitted scarves and balaclavas for sailors, or for the Indian sailors, or sent food parcels to prisoners of war. One of the things, perhaps, which supported the Lascars' cause was the very strong sense that they had concern for their families back in South Asia. And one of the things which they really campaigned very much for were better compensation deals if they were killed, and also better systems for remitting money back to their families, often in regions that now are in East India or Bangladesh. So the British government's initial response to these strikes was punitive, with many facing imprisonment and deportation, but there were wage increases. In September 1940, wages were increased by 1942, wages were more than 100% higher than they had been, and by then they were doubled again. So they did kind of really manage to almost equalize their wages by the end of the war. The Lascar Seamen's strikes were among the earliest organised labour movements in the UK involving non-European workers, and their actions laid the groundwork for future labour rights advancements and highlighted the need for racial equality in the workplace. Today, their legacy is commemorated in various memorials and historical accounts acknowledging their pivotal role in both the maritime industry and the broader struggle for workers' rights. This is a memorial that's in Calcutta. In May 1920, a memorial was conceived to be built on the banks of the River Hooghly at Calcutta in the memory of the Indian seamen who had died at sea serving on merchant ships during the First World War. And the people of Calcutta decided to build this memorial to be visible to ships sailing along the River Hooghly. But after the British left, I suppose, and after 1947 until 1994, this memorial was forgotten and neglected and not maintained. But there's been a kind of resurgence of interest in it. It was restored and re-inaugurated in a ceremony in 1994 and is now floodlit and has become a kind of a much more visible monument in the life of the city. The other important aspect about the Lascars in port cities and their legacy is that they played a foundational role in Britain's multicultural history, settling in places like East London, I've mentioned Brick Lane, Tiger Bay in Cardiff, and Toxteth in Liverpool, sometimes marrying locally, opening cafes, lodging houses, and small shops. They sold curry powders, perfumes, and worked in local industries, because one of the aspects for these Lascars was that they could sometimes use their mobility as a way of trading items on the side. A small number remained in Britain, forming the foundation of today's Asian and Yemeni communities in cities like Cardiff, Liverpool, and London. And there are other places around the world, like in Hong Kong, where Lascars formed a distinct enclave around Lascar Row, selling Chinese antiques and artifacts bought from voyagers. So over time, this history has started to emerge, but is also sort of embedded in Britain's social and cultural fabric. So just to move towards a conclusion, why do Lascars matter, and why should we still think about the history today? Well, I think it's linked, as is Bermuda, to histories of empire, migration, resistance, multiculturalism. They were an invisible force that powered Britain's global economy in many ways and sustained its wartime logistics and helped shape port cities. And I'm personally really interested in how non-European people of all sorts of backgrounds and play in all sorts of different places help to sustain Britain's war efforts, and how these supply lines and infrastructures really kind of are vital to making the fighting of the First and Second World Wars possible. And yet how overlooked some of the key individuals who were involved have been, despite their kind of crucial role in those histories. So only now are these men gaining the recognition, rights, and respect they have deserved. Thank you very much, and I'd be really pleased to hear questions or comments.
Well, thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm going to open it to the floor for any questions, and anyone who's joining us virtually, please put your question in the group chat.
Thank you, Jasmine. It's a fantastic presentation. I was wondering how dependent on more evidence of Lascars taking part depends on the interest of new academics, new researchers who've got the language, maybe to get more deeper stories, deeper connections with the Lascar community.
Thanks, and I think that's a really good question, and I think language makes a huge difference if people can do oral history interviews in particular. I've actually mainly used English language sources that are sitting in places like the National Archives in Kew, and in the India Office records, which are held in the British Library in London, because quite often military records and the English language documents have kind of glimpses. And so I think this idea of reading against the grain, or trying to look in official and state papers for kind of characters who can crop up when you look at them from an angle, can be quite effective, and it kind of means that we can see sort of more marginalized groups even in more official papers. But I think, yeah, there is definitely a sense that as more people become interested in these sorts of histories, and new scholars come into the field, that there's lots of possibilities of trying to kind of create more, I suppose, more equal histories. I think that's what.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering whether Lascars were involved in the Boer War at all.
That's
any information about that? Because in Bermuda, just by coincidence, Britain sent prisoners, Boer War prisoners, to Bermuda. So I was just out of interest. I'm just wondering whether they were involved in that war.
So that's really fascinating, because I actually had a student who was looking at the role of Indians in the Boer War, and there were a lot, and I think a lot more than has traditionally been quoted, but they were looking at kind of non-combatants who were working in auxiliary roles on the ground rather than Lascars. And Gandhi was famously an ambulance, a stretcher bearer in the Boer War. So there were lots of people involved actually there on the ground. But about the Lascars, I don't know, and that would be really good to look into. My hunch, but I don't have the evidence, is that they're more present than we know in all sorts of places, and that quite often the estimates that are given and the numbers that are given can be revised upwards, because people weren't always tracking these things. I do think, I mean, one advantage though is that for other groups, you can't tell by name. So for black sailors, you can't always identify people, whereas with the South Asians, at least the names are more traceable and you can kind of see that. So that actually gives a kind of means in the archive you can see ethnicity, I suppose, in a way that's not always possible for other groups.
Thanks, Yasmin. Another question?
It's me again. I was just wondering if the British Crew List project would be helpful. Have you looked at them? Because that's a fantastic database of the 20th century, and it might identify Lascars in
That's great.
use.
That's great. I'll have a look at that. Thank you.
Another question?
Yes, I had a tour of a Royal Navy auxiliary service ship in the 1980s, and I went below deck, and most of the signs were in Chinese.
Yeah.
So, had there been a transition from India to I guess, from the Crown Colony of Hong Kong was probably where they came from.
Yeah, that's it's a really good point. So I think after 1947, after the independence of India and Pakistan, Hong Kong obviously was still in British hands, and there was a real shift towards Chinese and particularly the kind of links with Hong Kong. And one thing I've been looking into was also a group of women, because women don't always feature in this story very much, but there was a group of women in Hong Kong called Jenny's Side Party, and they would be paid by British ships, or the kind of men on British ships, to clean the ships, to bring provisions, and they were kind of an unofficial sort of auxiliary service, I suppose, in Hong Kong. But I think a lot of the in the sort of later part of the 20th century, there were lots of Chinese workers on these ships, and I think it is something quite peculiar to the British Navy and something that's a real sort of legacy of empire, isn't it? I think linked to those imperial histories.
Yasmin, we also have a question from the chat.
Oh yeah.
Did other navies, e.g. French, Dutch, employ Lascars?
I think earlier on in the 18th century, I mean, there was so much cosmopolitan across armies and navies in the 18th century, and into the early 19th. But then I think the British system becomes particularly linked to South Asia, potentially because there is just such abundant labor source that is part of the British Empire. I don't know why else. I mean, but there seems to have been, it seems to have been much more kind of embedded in the British naval system. Obviously, the French in particular use a lot of North African soldiers and soldiers from their imperial territories. But I don't know, I think I'm right in saying that's not so much in their merchant fleet.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions that I can see on the chat and in the room, unless anyone has any other questions in the room. Right, one more.
No, just one comment for the United States Navy. The Philippines was a real source of labor into the 1980s. There were U.S. Navy had recruiting offices throughout the Philippines to recruit Philippine nationals into the U.S. Navy. There was a special contract.
That's really helpful and really good information. Thank you. Because I would really like to expand this project to think about all kinds of other ways in which non-Europeans have supported military conflict in the 20th century. So that's really helpful. Thank you.